Welcome to the Piano Sonatas of Beethoven. The Piano Sonatas of Beethoven are a volume of work that is this large. Unfortunately, we only have 2 hours, and 2 hours is not nearly enough to give 600 plus pages of some of the most serious classical music ever written any sort of justice. But we will go over some of the highlights and the important underlying themes of this seminal series of works by Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was a revolutionary that lived in revolutionary times. And he is often considered to be the composer that catalyzed the transition from what is called the classical period of music to what is called the Romantic era in music. In Gregorian years, he lived from 1770 to 1827, and this is a period of time in which Europe was in tumultuous chaos, on the path of a massive paradigm shift, a change in Europe's political and philosophical thought in his surroundings. Beethoven was definitely influenced by this revolution, and eventually he contributed to being part of this revolution himself through music. Beethoven supported many of the new ideas that were spawning in political discourses of his time. And in particular, he supported the idea of a republic over a monarchy. And his music sometimes reflects this. Some of you may know the story of how he originally titled his Third Symphony, the Bonaparte, upon hearing the news that France was becoming a republic. And then later he heard the news that Napoleon has declared himself emperor, and that what has newly been established in France was not actually a new republic, and still rather tyrannical rule. And upon hearing this news, Beethoven tore up the first page of his Bonaparte symphony and rewrote the entire first page, retitling it Eroica, meaning heroic, no longer deciding to dedicate his symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte, who has betrayed the Republican thought that he so supported. And throughout Beethoven's music, one could see that from the very beginning, he rejected norms of musical standards of his time, and that as he grew older and he gained reputation in the musical community, he allowed more and more of these changes that he intended to bring to music to be exposed. And in this class, we will sample bits of Beethoven's piano sonata music all the way through the 30 years in which he wrote them. And we'll watch his piano sonata music, just like the rest of his works in music, evolve from being very recognizable as a classical sonata to a musical form that is so far departed from classical ideals that it is barely recognizable as a classical sonata and is almost entirely recognizable as just plain Beethoven, as Beethoven implements more and more of his revolutionary ideas in music. But before we get to that, I will go over an overview of some of the forms of movements in sonatas and the forms of sonatas themselves. You may be familiar with the three-movement sonata. This is the form in which you find most classical sonatas. So the sonata has three movements, and the first movement is usually in something known as sonata allegro form. The second movement is in one of many slow movement forms, including binary form and ternary form. And the third movement is often in something known as rondo form, and sometimes also another sonata allegro form. So what are these forms? The sonata allegro form is one of the most important ideas in the sonata, and it is a movement that itself is broken into three pieces, known as the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. In the exposition, several themes that will be the central theme of the movement of the sonata, and sometimes of the entire sonata, will be introduced. But the first theme will be in the key of the sonata, what is known as the tonic key, whereas the second theme will be in what is known as the dominant key, which is the key that is not the main key of the sonata, but rather the key that is the key with one more sharp or one less flat from the sonata. This is the case with sonatas written in major, usually. In sonatas that are written in the minor key, sometimes the relative major, which is the major key, which has the same number of sharps or flats as the minor, is used for the key of the second theme in the exposition. After these themes are introduced, the exposition goes through a few more sections around the ideas that it has introduced and closes off, and then enters in the new key rather than the original key a section known as the development. And in the development, the themes that were introduced in the exposition are taken and changed and played around with a bit, sometimes changed in parts of the theme to be something else, sometimes mashed together into little tiny pieces, and sometimes brought to many new different keys itself. Basically, this is where most of the plot happens. If this were a story, then the development of the sonata is the action of the story that leads up to its climax, and is the climax itself. The end of the development sees a section of music known as the dominant preparation, in which the listener is cued that the recapitulation is coming, that it sounds like the music is returning to the state in which it originally started. That is, a bunch of notes that are in the dominant key that hint that the original key, the tonic key, will be coming. And then that leads back to the third part of the sonata, the recapitulation. And the recapitulation recaps the ideas that were the central ideas of this movement of the sonata. That is, it is just like the exposition in that it has the two main themes that the exposition introduced, except this time there is not the key change to the second key for the second theme. And the entire recapitulation goes through in the original key, with the second theme modulated instead to the original key. And it usually ends in a coda, which is a small segment of music that is intended to bring the movement to a fitting close, often making the music die down or become really grand for a nice finish. The sonata allegro movement is usually a fast movement. Many of you probably know that allegro means fast. So the first movement is usually fairly fast. To contrast to this, the second movement is usually really slow and can be in binary or ternary form. Binary form is where there are two sections of music that are itself repeated and that are played first section, second section, second section. Or if you use letters to represent the sections, A, B, B. Ternary is where there are two sections of music, where the first section is played, then the second section is played, and then the first section is played again. So if you use letters to represent that, those blocks, that would be A, B, A. So in terms of musical sections, I'll write this down, AABB for binary, and ABA for ternary to recap. And after this fast first movement and this slow second movement, the sonata closes with a third movement, or a finale, that is in either sonata allegro form, as mentioned earlier, like the first movement, or a form known as rondo form. And rondo is where there is a main theme, which we'll call A, that is interspersed. That is, it has different contrasting sections within it that are different themes. So an example of a rondo form would be if it went or main theme, different theme, main theme, another different theme, main theme, or ABACA. Some rondos are ABAC, ABA, or ideas like that. The important central piece of a rondo is that there's a main theme that is played many times interspersed with different themes. And often rondos themselves have codas, especially in a sonata, given that it caps off a pretty large piece of music. So it better end well. Not all sonatas are three movements, even though this is the standard form. In the classical period, there were also four movement sonatas. And in the four movement sonata, the first and second movements typically stay the same, but the third movement becomes the fourth movement. And the third movement follows what is known as a minuet and trio form. A moderately paced movement that is fairly dance-like, a minuet that comes in beats of 3 per measure. And that's interspersed with a trio, which is a contrasting dance that often plays between two sections of minuet. So minuet and trio is a form of ternary form, where A is the minuet and B is the trio. Sometimes Beethoven plays on this theme and writes a third movement that is, instead of minuet and trio, scherzo and trio. S-C-H-E-R-Z-O is pronounced scherzo. And scherzo is a term that actually means to make a joke, and it is a musical movement that sounds like a joke and sounds like it's jocular or satirical or something of that form. And so that makes up the third movement in the four-movement sonata form, and the third movement of the three-movement sonata is moved to position 4 in the chronological order of a four-movement sonata. There's also the two-movement sonata, which usually only has the first and last movements of the 3 or 4-movement sonata forms. That is, the slow movement is also ostracized. Beethoven sometimes moves these movement forms around a little in his sonatas, especially later, because as I mentioned previously, Beethoven became more and more original with the ways he constructed his sonatas as he deviated more and more from the musical norms of his time. And in addition to this, Beethoven sometimes used two other forms of the movement of a sonata as well, one of which is called theme and variations, which is a musical form where a theme is introduced, and then this theme is evolved through many different forms that are substantially like the original statement of the theme, but is slightly different each time, or sometimes significantly different, but for which you can still tell the ideas of the original theme being there. And the other of his forms that he sometimes used is a fugue. And a fugue is a musical piece in which an idea is introduced, and then this idea is played many times, often interspersed with itself and with other themes, specifically usually one other theme, in a way that it makes a piece of music that sounds like playing the same series of notes in common succession once after another, but sounding evolutionarily different as you go through the piece of music. Beethoven mostly added this as a sonata movement very late in his life. It was quite a revolutionary idea. Now that we have recapped these various forms of movements of a sonata, that is, sonata allegro, slow movements, rondos, minuet and trios, scherzo and trios, theme and variations, and fugues, let's go back to the political and musical context of Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was born during the classical era of music. And music of the classical era was influenced by thoughts of the age of reason. During this time, a lot of political thinkers and philosophers emphasized the ideas of things that are caterable to the common person. That is, a lot of ideas that are typically considered sophisticated and for only the upper classes can be brought to all of people, and that all people deserve certain unalienable rights or ideas of the such that evolved during this time in the 18th century. And in particular, how this came about in its manifestations in music is that unlike the previous Baroque era, B-A-R-O-Q-U-E, Baroque, when melody lines were often complex and exquisite, and musical forms were often really fancy and very adorned with little notes that made lines look really sophisticated, the classical period embraced a new love for simplicity in melody and harmony, representing the search for fundamental ideas, these ideas that can be shared among and accessible to all people of various social classes. During the classical era, therefore, many themes were simple, and also most of the pieces were written in major because that was considered to be more of a simple thing. When you look at classical era composers like Haydn and Mozart, about 80 to 90% of their pieces are written in major. Ludwig van Beethoven will change that, writing substantially more pieces in the minor key, and specifically having a lot of his most important pieces written in the minor key. For those of you who know about Beethoven's symphonies, he wrote 7 of his 9 symphonies in major, but the 2 symphonies that were written in minor were his 5th and his 9th, 2 of the symphonies he is most well known for. Beethoven mostly wrote in major still, but not nearly to the staggering majority in the musical repertoire of composers slightly before his time. Eventually, composers after Beethoven will write in minor even more frequently than he did, but he is definitely a big player in bringing about this change of a lot of important musical works written in minor. Another thing about the classical period is because of its bias for simplicity and reason, music of the classical era underrepresented emotions that were linked to heroism and tragedy. That is, it failed to represent the biggest plots, the grandest ideas that could come about in the human experience. There were no rooms for really big stories of really great heroes or really deep, penetrating tragedies. And the musical representation of heroism and tragedy will come to be Beethoven's forte throughout his career, and I guess also his pianissimos. But I digress. Beethoven had 3 epochs in his music, as historians of Beethoven usually consider. He went through 3 stages where his music of that particular stage seemed to be revolving around certain ideas, and for which he went through a revolution in his musical thoughts to this next era of his music. The first stage, which is approximately the first 10 to 15 years of his musical career, can be called the classical era, where his music can be seen to be very adherent to the ideas of classical music. It is where he started off. But then the next 10 to 15 years are what can be referred to as his heroic era, where he wrote music that thought large and brought about these ideas of the proper musicalization of the ideas of heroism and tragedy that I mentioned earlier. And this last era, which can be considered the Romantic era, is where Beethoven has already well established himself as a great composer and went through a revolution in his musical thought to write very much to his own pleasings, and often wrote music that is well out of the norms of music for his day, and for which people of his time often would look at his music and think, what is this person writing? Is he a madman? But of course they knew about the great music that he wrote before, and thus probably concluded that it must just be ideas that society at that point has not yet come to understand. And indeed, near the end of his life, Beethoven wrote music far ahead of his time. He was far ahead of what could be expected of composers, because by this point in his life, he was nearly completely deaf. The expectations of him, if he were a composer, is to be able to bring musical thoughts together if he can't think of musical thoughts. And therefore, it is just that he be permitted to bring about musical ideas that are that pretty much walk into fantasy land, if I can put it that way. Beethoven's piano sonatas are an excellent medium in which we could progress through these stages of Beethoven's music. And I will play excerpts, and in some cases entire movements of Beethoven's sonatas, so you can hear music, piano sonata music from all through Beethoven's career. We'll actually start at the very beginning with Piano Sonata number 1, which Beethoven dedicated to Joseph Haydn, a previous classical composer and his teacher for a short while. And this is right at the beginning, so this is where you expect Beethoven's music to still be very resembling of classical ideals of music. So simplicity, reasonable passages, basic harmonies. And sticking to the sonata movements that are typically expected. Beethoven's very first piano sonata is written in minor. I mentioned before that at the time most music was written in major, and this was, to have one's first sonata be in minor was already pretty radical. If you know about Beethoven's symphonies, some of you may know that already in his first symphony, Beethoven already expressed his disapproval of the strict regulations of what's standard music at his time, and he would already start to think so in his first piano sonata. Nevertheless, we can still hear the classical era in this work of music. So the first piano sonata, the first movement, this is sonata allegro form. So you should be able to hear the themes in the exposition as I play approximately the first half of it over here. in that excerpt, you may have been able to hear the two themes of this exposition. They are and the music around that. And the other theme is notice that the second theme is in a different key. Specifically, whereas the sonata started in F minor, the second theme is in A flat major, which is the relative major to F minor. As I mentioned before, in the case of sonatas written in minor, often the new key that is chosen is the relative major to that minor. And now I'll play the end of the exposition, and you can hear where the development starts. And you can see that it is the same themes that you heard in the exposition, but slightly altered and going to new keys. It went from B flat minor to C minor most recently, even though the development started in A flat major. Later on in the development section, I'll play the dominant preparation going into the recapitulation. And you can see that it sounds, that is, after the dominant preparation was over, the recapitulation sounds just like the exposition, except that now, even though the first theme was played in the same key as in the exposition, the second theme was not played in the key that it was played in the exposition. Rather, it was modulated back to the original key, and the material between the two themes was altered to make this transition smooth. That is, whereas in the exposition, the second theme went, that is, in A flat major. In the recapitulation, the second theme took the path of, that is, in the original key of F minor. So that covers the first movement. In the second movement, we can see a classic slow movement of a sonata of the classical period. The second movement is in F major. The third movement is a minuet in trio form. The minuet, in which you can hear dance-like melodies, goes. And so on. And the trio, which is a contrasting dance, goes. And so on. And the last movement, which is usually a rondo form, but in this sonata is another sonata allegro form, is really fast. It's in prestissimo, and it is a fiery movement, which starts. That was, by the way, only the first theme. The second theme goes. And so on. The development of this movement goes somewhat like. And so on, and it develops like that. And the dominant preparation going into the recapitulation goes something like. And after a few measures, this movement comes to a fiery finish. And it goes. And that last part over there was the coda of the rondo, how this piece ends. That is in the original key of F minor, Beethoven's first piano sonata of his revolutionary career. This first sonata was in a pack of 3 sonatas that together comprise Beethoven's first publication, all dedicated to his former teacher, Joseph Haydn, and follows approximately the same themes, or, well, not musical themes, but ideas of being like a classical sonata. His music evolves slightly over time through the 5th sonata, which was his second sonata that is in minor. Specifically, it is in C minor, which we will start talking about the relevance of in the context of his 8th sonata, which is sometimes called the Pathetique Sonata, which, like the Fifth Sonata, is written in C minor. C minor is a key that Beethoven would time and again consider to be very close to home in its emotional importance, in that C minor was the key that Beethoven frequently resorted to for writing out his most sorrowful and tragic emotions, often dealing with his gradual but clear hearing loss, and also on an idea of talks with fate. That is, where Beethoven is imagining a conversation with fate in which he asks fate why it must be that he, a composer, must suffer hearing loss. And fate says, because I said so. And Beethoven pours his sorrows into great music, often in C minor, and reflecting the tragedy of his procession through hearing loss and other problems in his life as well, some of which are the result of his coming to grips with the fact that he is a composer that is losing his hearing. And the Eighth Sonata, the Pathetique Sonata, is the first of Beethoven's sonatas in which, before the exposition starts, Beethoven added on an introduction that is a little slice of music. Here it's 10 measures, but it's 10 measures in a slow tempo, that lead in to the main juice of the sonata. And in this introduction, you can hear what the conversation with fate that is going on is, with Beethoven being wistful over his condition and fate being mercilessly thunderous. And then it goes into a really rapid exposition, development, and recapitulation of this sonata, although it is interspersed with these moments of slow, sorrowful reflection that is in the spirit of the introduction. I will play here the introduction leading into the first and second themes of the exposition of the Pathetique Sonata. And that goes through the introduction and first and second themes of the exposition. After some closing material, the movement goes into one of those intermittent introduction-like periods and then goes into the development. And after a few more measures of development, that is the evolving of the ideas of the exposition into new keys and new forms, the dominant preparation into the recapitulation goes. Thanks. Measures later goes into the last section that recalls the introduction and speeds to its very emotional coda. And after those loud nails in the coffin that wrap up this really tragic first movement, the second movement, the slow movement, is written in a very contrasting A-flat major, which is not even the relative major to C minor. And from this point forward, Beethoven would often use a key that is an interval of a third away to write intermediate movements as the interval of a third becomes a key motivic idea that Beethoven becomes very fond of. The second movement is pretty well known, and I will actually play it in its entirety so that you can listen to all of it without me interrupting it with words in the middle. And you could represent a sort of walk that Beethoven goes and takes after a very terrible meeting with fate, pondering life and the choices in it. Whatever the choices he made in such a hypothetical walk, clearly he made the choices that would make him become one of the most important figures in musical history, as well as history in general, in terms of the ways in which his music has shaped the world. Of course, that has not happened yet at this stage in Beethoven's career, but he would go on, as the rest of this class will show, to revolutionize music. This last movement of the three-movement Pathétique Sonata is a rondo with theme. Thus returning to C minor and ending the piece of music in its original key. And up to the next sonata after this one, the ninth sonata, Beethoven keeps to the standard form of a classical sonata with a sonata allegro first movement, a slow second movement, and either a third movement, rondo, or a sonata allegro, or that as a fourth movement with a third movement, either minuet and trio or scherzo and trio. But at this point, Beethoven has started deciding to insert his own ideas into the sonata structure. Thus, in the 10th sonata, putting in a movement that is actually a theme and variations movement. Those of you who have heard Haydn's Surprise Symphony may get reminded of it a little bit. And it goes through several variations, including and you could hear how it has similarities to the original theme. And if you are not one of the people that are on their cell phones, you may also have heard its differences. Going forward, by the 12th sonata, Beethoven has decided to not only have theme and variations be a movement to insert in the middle, but totally replace the first movement, the sonata allegro form, with a theme and variations movement. In fact, the 12th sonata stands out as a sonata in which Beethoven just decided to do away with the entire sonata allegro movement idea, thus being a really norm-challenging sonata. In fact, the 12th sonata has 4 movements that are very different from each other, and one would almost think at first notice of this piece that Beethoven decided to write 4 separate pieces and put them together, and only after a little bit of analysis would one notice similarities beyond key. The first movement is theme and variations. I'll play the theme and the first variation. And you can see how the first variation is a sort of fancification of the main theme. This goes on for 4 other variations, and that comprises the first movement. The second movement is a very light-hearted scherzo. And so on. If you remember when I explained the scherzo earlier, you may be able to see the jocularity in this movement as compared to other movements. But after all the fun and games is done with, the sonata suddenly becomes very, very serious, because the third movement is the slow movement, and it is a funeral march. And specifically, it is written in the parallel minor, that is, the minor with the same tonic key as the major. That is, the rest of the sonata is in A-flat major, and this movement is in A-flat minor. If you have your circle of fifths memorized in music theory, you may know that A-flat minor is the key with 7 flats. all 7 notes flat. And here is how the funeral march goes. And so on. And then suddenly, as if the third movement wasn't a funeral march, pieces of music that Beethoven never wrote, which makes you wonder, with the second and fourth movement, how was the third movement a funeral if it was all joy and rejoicing around it? Did everyone decide to drown their sorrows in parties, or is this supposed to be a satire in juxtaposition or something like that? And that rhythm keeps itself going through pretty much the entire fourth movement. And that is the 12th Sonata, a collection of 4 movements of really radically different flavors. Beethoven's 13th Sonata and his 14th Sonata are both titled Sonata quasi una fantasia. So to loosely translate, sonata sort of like a fantasy. And Beethoven loosens up a bit further on the stringent standards of the classical sonata to make sonatas that are quite different from what one would expect in his time, even though this is still early on in his career and hasn't even gotten to the really different stuff yet. The 13th movement, like the 13th sonata, like the 12th sonata, has a first movement that is sonata allegro. That isn't sonata allegro, and leaves a sonata allegro movement for the fourth movement of the sonata. The main theme of this sonata, just to point it out, goes. For the first movement. And the second sonata, quasi una fantasia, is a sonata that many people, even outside the classical music world, know. And that is the sonata frequently called the Moonlight Sonata. And this is where it's important to touch on something that is a problem in the world of arts. And that is that it is quite a tragedy that there have been many artists and musicians and writers over the years that was not given any credit for their work and felt no appreciation from society during their lifetime. People that only became famous and became notable um, and became considered to have produced work that well reflects the human condition after they died. You may have heard the saying, death makes an artist, because of how many artists that only became of note after they were no longer around to see how of note they've become. Beethoven was not one of these people. Already just a decade or two into his career, he was famous all through Vienna and in Europe for his really great music. But his music suffers another tragedy that is often the case with arts and music and humanities, and that is that the works that people appreciate are not the works that he himself considered his greatest works. You may have known of several writers that have written books that a lot of people really like, but bemoan how the public has eschewed the works that they really put effort into and thought were actually deep writings. And the Moonlight Sonata is one of those works that Beethoven considered one of his minor works, and later in his life would often say, why do people not notice these much deeper works of music that I've made? And unfortunately, this sticks to this day, that the Moonlight Sonata is one of Beethoven's most famous pieces, despite the fact that he himself did not consider it so. And so, in appreciation of that, I will actually skip the Moonlight Sonata in this course of Beethoven over to the next one, to not overplay something that, if Beethoven was alive today, would consider definitely already overplayed. Incidentally, Beethoven did not call that sonata the Moonlight Sonata. A publisher appended the moniker Moonlight to it without his permission, and he was furious over this. But anyway, we skip forward to Beethoven's 15th Sonata, which is the last of Beethoven's first period, his classical period. So this is where the ideas of the classical era generally start to seriously dwindle in Beethoven's writing, and for which he starts to embrace a new standard of the representation of heroism and tragedy after this. But let's just take a moment to appreciate the last sonata that Beethoven wrote with a generalized classical idea in mind. This is the 15th piano sonata in D major, often called the Pastoral Sonata. Here goes its first movement. you can hear that this may sound like what you hear while from flutes of pastors and shepherds when you're walking through the countryside, or not, because right now it's the 21st century and this doesn't actually happen anymore. But back in the 18th and 19th centuries, when Beethoven lived, this is a scene that everyday people may be familiar with. As a sort of an aside, I'd like to point out the scherzo that comprises the third movement of this sonata, because I consider it quite unique and very playful. And with that, we will wrap up Beethoven's first period. Notice, by the way, this is half of Beethoven's sonatas. Beethoven generally wrote less piano sonatas as his career went on and went to pursue grander works that, as he gained reputation, he had more of a performer pool and an audience for. Nevertheless, his piano sonatas did continue to evolve. We will skip over to Beethoven's 21st sonata, which is one of his really famous ones. The 21st and 23rd sonatas, which are often nicknamed the Waldstein and the Appassionata, are considered the two central sonatas of Beethoven's second period, the Heroic period. And the first sonata is a sonata of grand positive emotion, and the second of grand negative emotion. Specifically, throughout this 21st sonata, the Waldstein, one could hear what sounds like the various chirpings and murmurings of lots of animals throughout a natural walk. And one can feel in tune with nature and the wildlife through the grandeur of the 21st sonata. And over there was the first and second themes, and you could hear the first theme, which sounds like the busy bustling of natural traffic, that is, the running around of various birds in the air, and maybe an occasional squirrel over the ground. And the second theme, which sounds like having nice thoughts about the beauty of life as one walks through it all. In the second movement, Beethoven does something special that he never did before, in that he linked the second and third movements together so that the second movement goes into the third movement. And specifically, the second movement is here labeled Introduzione, or introduction. and leads into the rondo, that is the third movement. The third movement, incidentally, is just a complete tribute to nature and its wonderful theatrical productions. And so here I'll play the end of the second movement going into the third movement. And over there, you can hear, as I mentioned, the last part of the second movement. And in the third movement, the main theme of the first contrasting section and the start of the second occurrence of the main theme. And just to give you a taste of how grand this movement becomes, I'll play the end of this movement with the last occurrence of the main theme, then the contrasting section, and then the coda. This is the longest movement in terms of number of measures that Beethoven ever writes, a total of 543 measures. And here's the last approximately 200. And that's the Waldstein, the 21st Sonata. And as I mentioned before, in contrast to this sonata of positive emotions, there is the Appassionata, the 23rd Sonata, a very cynical sonata which pierces at the depths of human nature and questions the central integrity of humankind and reflects on what terrible things that humans do to each other. And it is a really tragic piece. Through the first movement, you can hear an overwhelming darkness with momentary points where it sounds like things have gotten better and that there may be hope, only to have those such moments of hope instantly shattered by the reemergence of the terrible sounds of before. Going through the first movement.